All right, let's talk to our next guest here on the program. He comes by way of thefourthperiod.com and is the magazine as well, and you can follow him on Twitter at @thefourthperiod. It's our buddy Dave Pagnotta. Hey, Dave, how you doing?
Fantastic. How's it going in Montreal?
Very well, very well. It's Montreal, so it's taken us several days now to digest the Kirk Muller signing, which was almost like a parade downtown. People were very, very, excited about it. Now, but I want to get to a few things. We'll talk about the playoffs momentarily. But your cohort has been answering questions today on Twitter, Dennis Bernstein. And I guess people are asking him about some topics that relate to the Habs, and he's been weighing in, and I want to get your take on it, mostly really to put a rift between the two of you. Somebody asked him. Yeah, so somebody asked him the contenders for Steven Stamkos, and in order, Dennis has the Leafs, Sabres, and Habs as his top three. I'm wondering why the Lightning are on that list, but wanted to get your take on his thoughts.
Well, I think they're all contenders. I don't know if they're the top ones, but there's certainly there's going to be a ton of teams that are trying to get their hands on Steven Stamkos, and if he hasn't signed by now, you'd imagine that as much as he says he would like to, and as much as the Lightning say they'd like to, you'd have to imagine that with 20 days before he's allowed to talk to other teams. With that negotiation period in place the day after the first round of the draft, you'd have to imagine that a crap load of teams are going to be after him. And Tampa's still in the mix, and Montreal, you'd have to imagine, and I suspect will kick some tires on that possibility. Detroit, Vancouver, there are other options, Buffalo, etc., that are going to be heavily interested in pursuing Steven Stamkos. I don't know if there's a clear-cut front-runner at this stage. I think it's way too early to determine that. And if there's going to be some tampering questions that are going to have to be answered by some teams. But Steven Stamkos is a hot commodity, and he will be, this month. And there's going to be a lot of teams that want him. I suspect Toronto will kick the tires. I do not think he ends up in Toronto, and I don't think they will have serious interest in bringing him on for $10+ million.
Yeah, I don't think so as well. I think he'll end up under the $10 million mark just because of the salary cap not exactly rising and the fact that he does want to go to contender. They're going to need that money lower down. I mean, what are Taves and Kane making annually?
Well, I mean, these guys have cap hits of $10.5 million a season. Their salaries will kind of decrease as the duration of their term kind of winds up, but they're bringing in like $12 million a season. Anze Kopitar is going to make, I think, $11 or $12 million next season. So, and his cap hits at $10 million. So, has Steven Stamkos achieved what Kane, Taves, and Kopitar have? No, he hasn't. He's won a Rocket Richard Award, and he's gotten to the Stanley Cup final. He hasn't won a Stanley Cup. Those guys have won 3 and 2 respectively. So that falls into place, and that'll come to at the forefront of negotiations. You want all this cash? Well, that's nice. Good luck, but you don't have the Stanley Cup rings, you don't have the playoff trophies, and you've got a few regular season ones, and you've been bounced around from center to the right wing. So that's all going to come into play in terms of negotiations with Stamkos. I would be surprised if he ends up at $10 million, but I know his camp's probably looking for in and around that figure.
Dave Pagnotta joining us from the fourthperiod.com right here on Game Points with Matthew Ross. Dave Trentadue here as well. Jimmy G on the board. The other item that your buddy Dave, Dennis Bernstein from the Fourth Period also weighed in on in regards to the Canadiens was somebody asked him if he thinks they're a contender next year, and he said yes. If in the East they are a contender, if Carey Price is healthy. Now, in my mind, Dave, last time I checked, you need 6 top 6 forwards to be a contender in the NHL. I look at the Canadiens.
True.
And I see 4, and after 4, it looks like they needed a couple of other guys in the top 6. Ideally, you look at these teams in the Stanley Cup final right now. On the third line, centers like Nick Bonino, a Tierney on the other side. You really need someone like Plekanec to be slotted a little lower in the batting order, so to speak, to look like a contending team. Yeah. But your take on what you see next year from them if Price is healthy.
Well, I think I think they're a playoff contender, but beyond that, unless they fill some gaps, I can't really see. So I think for the Canadians, they're going to have to be able to pick up some depth. Now they could be counting on other areas like some of their young kids to come into play, but you'd have to like whether it's Sherbach or whether it's McCarron getting bigger roles. But there are holes on this team, and if they want to be legitimate contenders, they're going to have to fill them some way. I fully agree. They've got 4 top 6 forwards. They got to figure it out, and I think Marc Bergevin understands that.
All right, Dave, you mentioned Anze Kopitar a moment ago. Is he going to be the new captain of the Kings? Is it just a foregone conclusion?
Yeah, I can't imagine Anze Kopitar not being the captain of the Kings at this stage. The LA is another team that needs to make some moves and needs to figure some things out. I think defense is going to be a priority for them. They've got to figure out if they're going to be able to re-sign Lucic or not. And give him the term that he wants. He wants a long-term deal. They're looking at short-term. We've got to see what happens there.
Dave?
Hey, Dave, I want to ask you about Alex Radulov. He scored 24 and 23 goals in 46 and 53 games, respectively, during the past 2 seasons in the KHL. The Red Wings have been linked with him. He has a natural connection in Colorado with Patrick Waugh, who coached him in the Q. He's reportedly looking for $7.5 million a season. So my question for you is, do you see him getting that kind of money? And do you think he would be a good fit in Montreal?
Well, he reportedly made over, I think it was $11-12 million in the KHL per season. So, you got to imagine he's taking a hit. I would be very surprised if a team gives him, $6+ million a season. But there are teams that are interested in Detroit, as you mentioned, has been linked. Florida's been linked. There's some interest from, a few other teams. There was some reported interest from Toronto, but that appears to no longer be the case. With regards to Radulov, there's a lot of question marks surrounding him, and a lot of it has to do with his personality on the ice as well as off of it. And he's a hothead, and he's always been a hothead. And he was a hothead in the NHL. He was a hothead in the KHL. So that's going to come into play. I think, if anything, you're looking at a short-term deal for Alex Radulov, probably around $5 million a season. At least that's what I would give him, and go from there. A 2-year deal, maybe a 1-year deal, and you see how things go after a bit of an experiment. Can he play at the pace of the NHL now versus when he was in it? KHL is a different game. It's a wider game. It's more cross-action than end-to-end. So how's that going to play a factor into his style? It's a risk for any team. Personality even aside, just bringing in a guy of that, of that stature back into the NHL, just from a style point of view. But there are going to be teams, and there are teams that are interested, and I can't imagine him getting that high a price tag. But hey, I mean, if he comes in and scores, 30, 40 goals, like everybody in his camp believes he can, then he's certainly worth the cash. I just don't see a team taking that risk right off the bat. All
right, Dave, in terms of the Stanley Cup final, Pens, Sharks, we're at 2-1 here for Pittsburgh. Very, very exciting game last night. Your take on what you expect in Game 4 tomorrow night?
I expect much of the same from San Jose. There was a lot more fight out of them. There was a lot more edge. There was a lot more energy. It almost looked like, especially in that first first game, they kind of looked starstruck from what was happening there. So they got their bearings together. It was a bit of a tighter game in Game 2 for them. And Game 3, you thought, as soon as Pittsburgh scored that first goal, that they're going to turtle. That didn't happen, not with that group, and it shouldn't happen. I think there's a good chance we go back to Pittsburgh on Thursday, tied at 2. But at the same time, the Penguins, they've got a ton of talent there, a ton of guys that have been there before, that have the rings. They know what it takes to, keep that from happening. So I suspect we're going to see another very tight game overall. Similar to what we saw last night between the two clubs. Honestly, at this stage, it's a flip a coin for me in terms of what happens in the next game. I picked Pittsburgh in 6. I'm sticking to Pittsburgh in 6. but it's a hard 6. It's a tough grind.
It's a hard 6. I like that. Now, Dave, final question for you. Before and after you here on the program, we're talking about the most charismatic athletes of our time in honor, of course, of the passing of Muhammad Ali. You cover the sport of hockey. Who, in your mind, is the most charismatic guy right now in the NHL?
You don't know? I
want to get your take.
You don't know that it's PK? Everybody knows that it's PK.
All right. Is it PK 1 and the grade 8 number 2 maybe?
Yeah, you know what? Ovechkin, from that perspective, has really dialed it down from the outspokenness that he had and the borderline cockiness that he had coming into the NHL, and even a few years ago. He's really toned it down a little bit, which for me is disappointing because I love that stuff. I want to see that from him. And you see, I mean, look, Jaromir Jagr is a quiet version of that.
Yeah.
He's I don't give a you-know-what kind of attitude, and I don't care who knows it. And he shows up and he performs, and he's one of the greatest players of all time, and you got to deal with it. So he kind of falls into that category too. But you know what? There's a lot of guys in the National Hockey League that have it that just don't show it off as much as PK and that Ovechkin used to. And I wish I saw a little bit more out of Ovechkin again. Bring that back a little bit, and show the personalities of these guys a little bit more, because there's a ton of guys in the league that have it, that just kind of cocoon it from a public perspective. And
but you see it in Vegas annually, don't you? Huh? All right.
I do. I actually just booked my trip to the awards, literally right before you called.
There you go. There you go. Yeah, the Fourth Period always hosting something. TheFourthPeriod.com is the website. Go ahead and check out Dave and his team's latest reports on the NHL, both playoffs and off-season notes. Dave, thank you so much as always.
Pleasure, buddy. Have a good one.